Hi everyone, thank you so much for turning out today. I'm going to keep this brief and not take too much time, but as a virtue of quick background, spent pretty much all my life playing games or making games in some way or the other. The earliest stuff that I used to do was making game trainers. Not sure if that's something still quite popular in the public domain, but shareware days of the early 2000s, single player experiences were meant to be broken and the game economies were quite weak. So I used to sell game trainers on the internet. Eventually moved on to do other stuff in life, build a SaaS platform. Couldn't really sell it and figured out that gaming was the customers who ended up buying a lot of complicated math stuff. Ended up realizing that that's what I want to do full time and went on to work for game publishers, both Electronic Arts and Big Viking Games, good stints. And more recently, I'm investing in games at Matrix Partners. We are a seed to Series B fund, investing in any sectors from media, social, gaming, or adjacent businesses, right? So we are quite excited about it. And the idea of today is to really think deeply about what is it that is happening under the layer of gaming, right? Not necessarily a top-heavy, state-of-the-market sort of a view, but really the starting point was for us to try to figure out and articulate what is a landscape, right? I mean, people keep convoluting words like gaming, esports, RNG, you know the drill, right? Things keep getting confused. And I think the first step was for us was to really try to break it down and see how do things really sort of piece together, right? What we realized was that it's great to think of gaming businesses as consumer stacks. There is the hardware layer which is required for making many of these experiences work, where innovation is actively happening right now, and there is a whole bunch of businesses that are clumped under gaming content. And this is agnostic of the kind of business models that really go behind some of these businesses, right? More recently, we have seen adjacent businesses coming out which are built on top of gaming content, right? Which is streaming content, which is made out of the game content and community management and communication between players. And underpinning all of this is the technology layer which makes all of this work. And I think our perfunctory scans really stop with something like a Unity. But things tend to get a lot more complicated as you get deeper in, right? Live operations teams and game teams these days require a level of sophistication which is not what is required 5 to 6 years ago. So the technology space have expanded quite a bit there. So not going to spend too much time on the broader narrative, and I'm sure you guys will get better calibrated answers on that from my friends and colleagues. But it seems to be that the broader narrative is that the industry is very large, right? But I think the contrarian view that we hold at this point of time is it's a matured red ocean market at this point of time. And why is that the case? It does seem to be like a pattern interrupt in terms of what we hear on a day-to-day basis. But the global industry is already roughly nearly about 300 billion, and people keep varying that number in various error margins. And it seems to be the case that as far as India is concerned, that margin is even larger, right? Everybody seems to be clear that RNG has made money and it's doing well, but what about free-to-play, right? Things that we conventionally call as video games hasn't really done well. The narrative has always been there, but the business is too small to an extent that the largest of global publishers haven't really paid a lot of attention to India, or at least not yet, right? We are seeing a lot of that stuff changing right now. But the interesting trend that is really captivating everyone's attention is just the sheer size of the market and the opportunity at hand, right? There is not a lot of pockets of growth left globally for gaming, right? The Western markets have already reached a point where their revenues have started to sort of flatline and user growth, right? So the LATAM markets, India, and the broader Southeast Asian markets are where a lot of the incremental new users are coming into the market, and that has really been driving some of the growth. So it's great from a narrative perspective, right? More money will come into these businesses because the narrative is just so great. And you will hear all about why UPI and all the other rails is making life easier for developers and so on, right? So all that is good, but it's important to separate narrative from what is really happening underneath, right? And I think the next contrarian view that we hold is that we've actually been in a pretty disappointing turnout for the last 20 years that me and many of the other guys who are sitting in this room have spent in this industry. It hasn't gotten to a point where we can be proud of it and say that, hey, we finally created an export category which can follow IT services, which has gone to like 150 plus billion. Right? That has not happened yet. We've made large companies. There have been RMG companies which have done well. Global publishers have had their offices in India since early 2000s, right? EA was here from like 2005, 6. Zynga has been around. Ubisoft has been around. Multiple gaming companies have been coming in and building their talent. But what has kept on happening is some of the best talent keeps leaving the country because the opportunities have always been better outside. In the broader story of the narrative that we talked about before, this is something that we keep missing out, that folks have left, right? But that is changing a lot right now, primarily because of this narrative and a lot of attention that keeps coming back into the space. But it's important to call out that this has been a trend and it needs to have an active, conscious effort to sort of change that, right? Now, why do we say that gaming and new game development or just mobile gaming in general? Mobile gaming specifically because that is a market that we operate in. Console and a lot of other smaller segments of the market do exist and are relevant in India, but predominantly from a developer perspective, mobile is where the market is at, right? That's where the development talent is at, and that's where the highest amount of development is happening. And the real challenge from a macro perspective really starts from the consumption of the media itself, right? During COVID time, it was a secular bull run. Gaming kept on growing ever since 2008-9, and it's never really stopped in terms of growth, right? Double-digit growth all the way up until like 21, 22. What that has meant is people have looked at this opportunity, and there has been an excess supply of content, right? There are 10,000 plus games that are out there. Everybody competing for your share of attention, moving all the way from your TikToks and the Facebooks of the world. Because really the competition is for the share of time, right? It's the share of the user attention that gets really monetized downstream. And games have not had a very easy time trying to get into users' mind effortlessly, right? It's not the case anymore. And especially since COVID has also elapsed, people have started moving on to taking on more offline experiences, cut off from your digital native experiences, right? So those things have impacted the overall growth. But again, this is some more shorter term issue. But the more important trend over in the media consumption is the gradual shift away from in-app purchase behavior, right? Now, typically over the last 10, 15 years, if you looked at the balance sheets of Google or Apple, you would realize the amount of excess free cash that they generate just by running the app stores. It is a duopoly. Practically all publishers or the platforms where games are distributed are monopolistic. And they generate extraordinary amounts of revenue on the back of gaming developers, right? Now, that is slowly shifting primarily because a lot of adjacent businesses like dating, virtual in-app purchase for meeting friends and other social interactions have really started taking on. And it used to be the case where gaming was 90% of all in-app purchase market, and now that's dropped down to roughly about 60%. And the last thing that is really impacting in all of this is, here is the excess supply of content, here is all the other things that I could do. But really, what all of this is meaning is my expectations as a player is going up, and the quality which someone expects to play a game is also commensurately high, right? So to deliver that, your costs eventually tend to sort of spiral up. How do you sort of account for that? There are other concerns which are really pressing the market. We have had interest rates rising up over the last couple of years, and we are clearly seeing signs of capital becoming much more difficult to get access to, and we'll start seeing some of that impact coming into gaming industry also fairly soon. There have been concerns about not being able to access the global market as people would have expected, benign industry like gaming to have access to, right? It's not the case where a Chinese developer can market or distribute their game in India. There are geopolitical concerns which sort of stops you from doing that. And that's going to keep continuing to happen. And what that means is an effective lowering of TAM for some of the largest developers worldwide, right? And broadly, since most of the free-to-play money has been made from gambling adjacent behaviors, and even true for India for RMG, it is going to be the case that there is going to be a secular move towards moving away from these gambling adjacent behaviors because it is a political issue that can be easily be galvanized. But I think the biggest challenge of all of this is really distribution, right? I think if there is one problem that needs to be absolutely nailed is to figure out how to do distribution well. CPIs have been trending up ever since the wave happened, and it doesn't seem to be going down. And the real challenge is not just the cost increasing from the competition, it is that the infrastructure which was underpinning how games are distributed is fundamentally changing, right? it used to be the case that if I was a gaming developer in 2017, I have a game which is prototyped out, tested out well, I can go out to the market, rely on Facebook and Google to find me the most relevant users, bring them on board at a reasonable cost, and then monetize them downstream. It's not as easy anymore because you can no longer tie everything back together to the unique user identifier of whoever is playing your game, right? It doesn't sound like a large enough issue, but fundamentally that changes how a gaming company would need to think about distributing their product worldwide, right? Now, this is not just being enforced by the platforms, because clearly something that favors the platforms, right? Because any regulation that is coming in is regulatory capture for Apple and Google because they make excess amounts of money, the advertising industry is being choked out, and the dollar spends are being shifted to Apple ad spend, right? So great for them. But as far as a developer is concerned, there is a lot of uncertainty right now to figure out where is the relevant user for me. Is it a high enough value user, and can I spend without worrying too much or having to justify to my CFO that this is what I have to do and this user is actually valuable, right? Now, when it comes to specifically to funding and what can be done to build like a gaming fundable business, there are options out there, and the most obvious one is sweat equity, right? Just going at it yourself, trying to build a business that makes sense. There have been attempts, more so scattered, to try to crowdsource and then gather capital to build game, and there have been some reasonably successful attempts at it. We are seeing grants and incubators being set up across, and that's a relatively easier access to capital, provided you have the talent. But really what it boils down to in terms of the easiest answers to where capital can be raised is really project financing and equity, right? Project financing is your typical publisher style relationship where there's a royalty / rev share involved. And equity is where typically VCs play, right? They take a percentage of ownership of a company in return for capital that can be used to grow your business, right? Specifically looking at the VC segment of the funding market and what really sort of keeps it apart, right? On a broader trend, I think as we previously talked about before, the funding environment globally is dropping from 2021 highs, right? Now, this is a global view. It could very well be the case that in India, that trend is likely to take another couple of years to come in, right? But it is reasonable to assume that risk capital is going to be much more conscious of what is the hurdle rate that you need to cross as a business for an investment to make sense, right? And I think that's the point where a lot of people keep getting lost about what is it that really the VCs are looking for when it comes to underwriting an investment, right? The reality is that the constraints are set by the pure probability of how funds operate and what do they really have to achieve, right? And I really recommend this article from Kaufman if you guys want to go deeper into it. Your probability of success when you are backing an early stage company of them breaking out and becoming a market leader is extremely low. And the chart on the right demonstrates what's the probability by stage, right? It's a fairly simple chart. I'm just trying to simplify what exactly is going on in terms of probability, right? So at each stage there is risk, and risk keeps getting compounded, right? When you multiply probabilities, it becomes worse. So what does it really take to underwrite, right? So early stage VCs probably partner somewhere in the earliest part of the chart, and you don't really have much to go ahead with, right? Probably you have a game which is somewhat in the soft launch, and that's great. But if you don't have that, you really have to underwrite either the broader narrative, which is, hey, the market is big, there is a lot of people, there is access, there's something that you can do to get to paying customers, or that there is a stellar team who have done this stuff in the past and they can potentially rally and build a team around them and solve some of these problems, right? So essentially, it's signal matching to try to ensure that your probability of failure is lower. Because as far as a VC is concerned, if you don't make a 50x return from an individual investment, it doesn't make sense for you to put in the effort, right? One could presume that, hey, that seems greedy enough. If I invest a couple of $1 million in a project, if I make 4 million, what's wrong in it? Is it the case that we always have to shoot for 100? But the structures of funds are set up in such a way that if 10 other investments are going to fail from a 200 million fund, the one investment would still need to make 20 or 30 for the entire effort and the management fee to make sense. Right. So if you look at the preference that these people have exhibited when it comes to the kind of businesses they want to back, clearly there have been some trends, right? As far as India is concerned, RMG has been red hot. People had invested a bunch of money, and very valuable businesses have been created in this area, right? Your Dream11, MPL, Zoopies of the world. Fantastic businesses, generates cash once every quarter and just funnel it back. And Indian customers seem to love it. There is a financial expectation of reward. But then there are other business models which are relevant too. And a lot of us as gamers do think of typical box sales as the real conventional games to be played, but VCs do see them as capped outcomes, and that's quite challenging. And I think that's where freemium really takes center stage, and it's really important to appreciate why that is the case, right? Why do people keep pushing for freemium? It's not necessarily the case where in-app purchases are what sort of drives a lot of their outcome, but it could potentially become extremely large, right? The possibility for a Steam-based game or a typical platform publishing, and there's an upfront cost. For you to get to a venture scale outcome, that would require outlier success. But in free-to-play, probably there's a way for you to mechanistically get there. It's not clear, but it's possible, right? There's a possibility there. Now, obviously, there is Web3 and stuff, and probably we shouldn't be talking too much about it because we haven't seen any success, right? So there's no real point of spending too much time there. If it happens, we will know, and we will probably pay attention. But the reality is that while it's great while you're building out all the esports businesses and all the community engagement features, content has to be made, right? For this industry to grow and flourish, there needs to be enough amount of content, gaming content, actual games being made for a global audience for us to be an industry which is secure from a financing perspective and big enough to accommodate all the people who would want to work here. And now why is that the case, right? Because content is ultimately at the heart of why people play games, and this is where all the customer funnel eventually leads down to. And it is very hard to sort of draw clear lines between how genres are sort of split across, and people typically tend to struggle here, right? You can broadly classify as casual, mid-core, hardcore. But the reality is that the approach of the business, your unit economics, your requirements of production, how do you engage and acquire users, these all fundamentally change as you think from making a hyper-casual game, which might be an extremely low-cost production endeavor, towards building like a shooter game, which is an order of magnitude more complexity and involves more capital, right? So depending upon your skill level, your amount of capital disposal, picking the right subgenres to play in is a signal that VCs attribute a lot of value to. Now, I think coming one level deeper, right? So let's assume that a team is pursuing the right business model, and the team is pursuing genres that they can operate in fairly confidently. Like, what matters more, right? As I said before, the bigger challenge is distribution, right? So what do you do to solve for distribution in a way that can de-risk your business in some way? And typically the answer is lied somewhere between brand and performance, and this is an area where Indian developers have struggled quite a bit, right? We have been able to make games and production has been there, and ultimately a good exit for a lot of developers has been that, hey, if a publisher comes and buys my game for whatever, it's going to make an outcome. But the ability to self-publish, create my own game, create my own distribution, either by building a brand for myself or by doing performance marketing, direct response advertising, has been very hard, right? It's not something that folks are very used to. I think brand marketing, India has seen a bunch of good stuff from FMCG companies, but in performance, we're still way, way far to go. And probably it is the biggest bottleneck in the industry right now. We just don't have enough number of people who know how to do very deterministically, how do I optimize on a campaign-to-campaign basis? How do I adjust for cost? When do I start looking for high-value users when they have to pay a lot of money? And how do I ensure that I'm breaking even from all my investments, right? So if this is an area where you as a developer are struggling with, probably talk to your friends. Now, I think the more obvious one is the product execution itself, right? And typically this is the reason why a lot of folks do tend to prefer seasoned folks who worked in the industry, right? The real reason is compared to like a typical consumer app, there is a lot of complexity involved in making live services work well. And you can think about it in terms of your life cycle, right? Let's say that we acquired users like we talked about. You did performance or brand or a combination of both of them and acquired users. Now we need to engage them. We need to keep them interested in the core loop, keeping them played again and again. Hopefully they come back on the next day. Typical retention profiles, by D30, you lose almost all the people that you get. Maybe 3 or 4 remain. So a lot of work needs to go into ensuring that engagement is something that you consistently drive upwards. When it comes to retention, folks do tend to gravitate towards the easier answers, right? I'll just do an appointment mechanic. I'll just add a meta, right? But it tends to be a lot more complicated than that. And it really involves you to orchestrate what is it that production is going to do to create content, which will keep the player engaged and continue to sort of tie it back to the business, right? Because production is where most of your cost is going to go. Because if you think of a typical seed-funded company, somewhere between $3 to $5 million. I'm talking about VC-funded companies, but it's equally true for companies in the lower end of capitalization. They would spend most of your money on production. So making sure that you're placing the right bets in terms of what you're building out to get your hypothesis is what really matters a lot. And the last one is monetization. And I'm pretty sure that folks like us or even our publisher friends out here would be willing to underwrite if you don't see actual monetization happening, given that there is proof points of retention or engagement happening, right? But typically, it is very hard to fix the monetization of a product which doesn't have spend depth accounted in its game design, right? You can't force fit a saga map or a progression and expect that people will spend 4x or 5x, right? You should be looking at more examples of globally successful companies who have done deep work in trying to create an experience where people can spend thousands of hours. Economy management becomes equally important because that's what really drives people to continue spending in the game, right? Now, I think one thing that we index heavily on more than anything else is just signals from the folks who would start out, right? Because even though we would have liked to underwrite a lot of gaming businesses on the basis of early soft launch metrics, it just hasn't happened yet, right? We don't see enough amount of teams coming to us and saying that, hey, here is our D7 ROAS, and here is how our early retention is looking like. With X amount of capital, we are going to scale, right? We hope the ecosystem will get there. Eventually, we will. But ultimately, we think that the answer will come from teams who are well constructed and are taking a pragmatic view of going to the market, right? And the answer, unfortunately, is not just coming in from one domain. You need some amount of balance between the right business acumen and the creative vision to sort of make something that people will have fun with, right? It's not a typical problem that you would face in a SaaS company, for example. You need a compelling vision and a narrative which will drive user engagement and attention. But you also need the creative team to be flexible enough to say that, hey, it's not just the game that matters, but it's also the advertising that I do, and how do I drive click-through on the top of the funnel onto my game, and not being really too married to my idea of what a great game is. On the business front, you do want people to be more hypothesis-driven, think more in terms of, I do not have a high conviction idea, but I do have an inkling of what might work. And if I do certain things and I test out the hypothesis, I might figure out something, right? So that's what we would have liked to see a lot more. On the technical front, I think a lot of complexities are being solved as we speak, and a bunch of improvements have been happening. There are tools that you can buy off the shelf to ameliorate for a lot of problems that you would have had. For example, you might say that, oh, I want to build a social game, but I don't know how to engineer a multiplayer social backend. There are off-the-shelf tools which can help you reduce time to market. But it's important that you take a very measured view of that, because this is where your production timelines tend to get pushed out and you go wrong on your capitalization math. Moving quickly ahead on the back end, we talked about it briefly, but it's not quite appreciated what's the level of complexity which is required to be put into the game beyond the first 0 to 1 phase. Build like a compelling core loop, there's some amount of engagement. A lot of things need to be orchestrated on the back end for you to make a game which doesn't just spike up during its launch success and just flatlines out, and you want to keep it into a revenue generating machine, because we cannot underwrite a business which is just making money for 6 months. It's not a viable business anymore. It's a creative endeavor where you're just trying to get a game out there and just see what happens, right? Rigorous live service teams iterate very heavily on the outcomes that they receive from their game. They keep releasing updates and they keep tweaking various parameters of what happens under the hood to ensure that they are able to get to that point of delivery, right? And this goes all the way from just the core loop to how do you take the engagement and revenue, how do I ensure that the right offers are shown to users, how do I ensure that the content pipeline is in a right way that things don't crash, how do I ensure that the build size is low enough that a user from India could download, right? These things matter a lot, and teams which are very metric driven would eventually find out these answers and try to get to better solutions, right? I'll quickly talk about tailwinds which make things interesting, right? Because from the narrative that I've given so far, it does seem to be that it is broadly a hits and misses driven business, but at the right hands of a team which is iterating fast enough, things might be exciting, right? So what are the trend lines and themes which typically will drive the narrative for the next couple of years, right? And I think this is already happening. Gen AI is what everybody keeps talking about, and your investors and your publishers and your friends will keep asking you, what are you doing in Gen AI and how is that impacting your game production, right? We are yet to see like meaningful impacts in production cost. We don't think that is likely to happen, at least immediately. But the clear answer is supply can increase by an order of magnitude, right? Because if you look at live service, it is about creating incremental content. So for once you hit a game which has some degree of scale, it might be easier for you to launch more content and optimize more value from it. But there are other areas where things could really change fundamentally, right? The reason why I would have not like to bring it up at all, but the reason why I'm bringing it up is this is what you're going to see a lot, trendline investing, right? People investing behind narratives and themes. And it might be useful to tag along on one of those themes. Think of your early crypto and NFT days, and then now the Gen AI wave, right? So there are people who ride those coattails to raise capital cheaply and then figure out a product, and obviously most of the money will get destroyed. But that's fine, right? That's the game that we are all in. But if you think about the technology a bit deeper, it is clear that you can see how this can impact how games are fundamentally made and how interactions happen, right? Imagine a GTA or a Red Dead Redemption where you can actually talk to people and they have context-aware memory. That's likely to be life-changing. And I'm not sure if you guys have tried out Replica or one of these more modern applications which really are trying to replace relationship and trying to solve your loneliness as a problem, right? And I think gaming has typically been one of those solves for people who are socially not very well adjusted. And there does seem to be a bunch of activity that is happening to sort of promote that. But on the underlying technology front also, we can expect changes to happen from the perspective of making it much more easier for a developer to create content without having extraordinary amount of code being written, all the way down to personalizing the kind of offers that you see, the kind of in-app purchases that you're being offered, or the kind of content or the kind of thematic style that might appeal to you, right? You could think of a world where these things are not made deterministically by a developer and a concept artist somewhere, but is made for you based on your context-specific behavior, right? It will take time, but it's something that we feel fairly positive is going to happen. Another tailwind which is quite interesting to look at is the transmedia trend, right? And the reason why this is important to pay close attention to is, like I said before, your performance channels do not work in the way that you would have intended it to. And there are all these IPs existing around the world which have a lot of residual value in terms of what they represent to people. And one could make an assumption that when you play it right, when you take an IP and marry it to a design style that works well, you might be able to address to that core audience, and hopefully that effectively lowers your cost of acquiring users, right? But we are seeing this IP transmutation happening from across, right? Like moving from games to movies, games to OTT, backwards and forwards, right? And these are all becoming large value unlocks. So as a developer, when you're thinking of building a business from ground up, you could think that, hey, in order to de-risk my distribution, I might do an IP partnership. Or you might think that, hey, I want to own this IP, I want to build this out, and I want to build a brand out of it, right? So it is important to be very, very conscious about how you're going to build up some of those efforts. Now, the last one that I would like to call out, which is going to be important, is the cross-platform play and cloud-based gaming, right? And I do tend to disagree with the broader CMA judgment that cloud gaming is the problem today. But it's relatively easy to see that in a world where all the major platform monopolies are controlling cloud services and the technology gets better and latency starts dropping, it is possible that a 1.5 gig game played on a small device is very possible, right? Without actually having to go through the hoops of downloading a game and putting it out there. And if you haven't tried it, I would highly recommend trying out the Microsoft game streaming service. It's just a sliver of what the promise that is out there for you to be able to do that, right? This is also accelerated by the fact that on-device computing is also getting a lot better. So if you looked at the latest Apple keynote, you see the kind of improvements that's happening on on-prem compute. And that really has implications in terms of what you could deliver in terms of experiences to a mobile customer, which used to be quite limited back in the day, right? Think of what happened in 2017 when the 4 gig RAM phones and your relatively stronger Qualcomm processors came out. That enabled shooters to actually become a reality, right? Now, I think the answer might lie in what is it that would be similarly interesting when you're trying to combine some of these trends, right? But I guess at least at this point of time, as things stand, it's not interesting enough, right? The revenue pool is not large enough. And I don't know if you guys remember the slide that I showed at the very beginning. The overall gaming content revenue is like 200 billion plus, and esports still, the entire market cap has not crossed $1 billion in revenue. That's probably telling about where value gets accrued in this business, right? So yeah, I mean, that's the talk. Do feel free to reach out to us any point in time. We spend a lot of time in gaming trying to deeply understand what is it about, what can we do, is it actually venture backable? And really what we realize is that the best way to do it is to build along with folks who are really passionate about it. So more than happy to chat with anyone, especially when you're thinking about a fundraise, you should probably reach out to us. If we are not the right fit, we'll probably get you to the right people. But regardless, hope to actually do some real work to make this industry what it actually should be. Thank you.